So, I mean, if you were talking to a development practitioner who wanted to look at sustainability, what are the 4 or 5 things you could tell them from this experience of yours in Durban that might sort of interest them and could sort of, let's say, invigorate them to keep going? Because this is obviously a difficult landscape.
Absolutely.
And you have, a legacy that comes from Mandela and that transition there. And we're trying to take it into a very different world, both inside and outside. So what are the 4 or 5 things that you might find interesting for them to sort of...
I suppose top of my list is be brave and never lose your integrity, because in this sea of words and changing social values, you've got to have a core course that you stick to. So I think there's and that's surprised me about it, is that change very often starts with individual change. So believe in yourself as a practitioner and know what ideals that you are changing. A very powerful tool, I think, is science, and we've not brought enough of the available science, global science, into our local work. We've never known more than we have at this particular moment in human evolution, and yet we deploy it so poorly. And by science, I don't necessarily mean the big and complex data sets, but I mean some of the core messages that are guiding lights on what that new roadmap looks like and what direction it might be going in. And I think we owe it to ourselves as urban practitioners to be aware of that science and to engage the scientific community, who are increasingly more and more looking to form bridges with us. And I think we've got to be active and reach out to them. I think the ability to stay the institutional course. So while you as an individual might move through a variety of iterations in your career, how does the work that you do set up an institutional course that will maintain its continuity and purpose through time? And what are the mechanisms there? It generally means building this team of other champions, so that as champions move in and out of play, there's someone who always holds the long-term memory.
Yes, irrespective of what political party is in control or, what agency is running it, absolutely. Yeah.
And an important part of that is document. It's something that
That's a hard part of life, yeah.
David Satterthwaite has been remarkable like that. I would attribute sort of the documentation Durban does largely to David's nagging, in the sense that unless you write it down, it's of no use to either you locally or to international learning. Exactly. And then I think probably the most recent lesson for us is, having determined your course, having held it firm, having built a team that is deploying science, having documented all of that, reflect, because you can become so blinkered in chasing that new goal that you forget to adjudicate whether the path that you're on. And that's quite a complex space. It's a new space, this whole idea of monitoring and evaluation, particularly because all the values you're monitoring and evaluating are largely societally driven and change through time in dynamic societies like ours. How do you constantly ensure that you're on the right path? So be innovative, don't be scared to develop the tools you might need, don't be scared to fail, because failure often brings the most important learnings, and just feed that into the system.
Exactly, that's part of the process of innovation.
Into the system,
And so, to move from the level of the practitioner to the city, what are the big things that Durban has learned over the years that are actually useful for not only Southern African cities, but cities in the global south and even in the north for some senses? Because this is a very interesting landscape. It has many of the elements of what the latter part of the 21st century is going to be like, a mix of different institutions, politics, and a set of incremental changes. What are the things that you think other people would be happy to learn from you and you could contribute to, let's say, the global and the regional debate?
I think for us the big learning has, and this is something that I think besets a whole range of global south cities, is the need to transition from the concept of government as the deliverer of change to governance as the deliverer of change. Because if you make that ideological leap, number one, it talks to the fact that as government you must be prepared to govern, which means you must be prepared to put in place the tools that are necessary. You must have town planning schemes. You must be prepared to enforce them, no matter how difficult that is. So the rule of law becomes important. But understanding the rule of law doesn't work in a society that's battling with issues of social cohesion. So the question of forming partnerships out into the various elements of society. And particularly in the global south, those elements of society can be as diverse as large industrialists to traditional leadership, and recognizing that you need to develop new tools. That it's not going to be a question of you taking your plans to people, but that you're going to have to develop tools that allow them to come to you with their priorities, with their views, to play a very active role in your space. And that is very uncomfortable for government. And for us, that idea of a mutual stewardship, a global responsibility, and finding and creating the platforms to have that debate and to sustain that debate has become very important, which means we've had to retool ourselves and we've had to reskill ourselves to have that debate, to work in areas where land tenure doesn't operate in the systems that we understand, to understand that worldview, and to be able to bring that worldview, ironically, back into the democratic system, because we found that the democratic system can itself become quite autocratic if it believes in itself too entirely without constantly adjudicating itself against society's voices. And we've had a huge amount of challenge in trying to create those open mechanisms for society to talk to us. We've also, I think, been firm as a local government around the role of science. Science is not perfect, doesn't bring an ultimate truth, but it does bring a new tool set. And I think if there's another important message to cities in the global south, looking at the way you reconceptualize the urban practitioner. Gone are the days when the urban practitioner was the person who handed out the dog license disc. Urban practitioners are now people who are part of large teams running the biggest organizations in the world. Cities control the world.
Absolutely.
We're part of big corporates. Every large corporate needs an R&D facility. So local government should not be scared of hiring highly skilled science practitioners. And when I use the term science, I, as a person who's trained in the natural sciences, have learned that embraces the social sciences.
Absolutely, and economics,
And we've got to conceptualize that local government needs people with PhDs who can think big things.
Yeah. And they need to partner with universities to work very closely with them.
Exactly, we need all those partnerships. Yes. And again, that's something we've had to do, is we've had to reach out to the tertiary institutions saying, we need this link. You're part of our day-to-day business. It's not a nice to have, you're an absolutely essential part. And that in itself is creating new relationships that are often difficult to broker in the first instance, but are so productive once you get them up and running.
Okay, wonderful. We've been talking to Deborah Roberts this morning about sustainability in cities, especially in Durban, and the role of urban practitioners in making this possible.